The biggest environmentalists in the world should be Christians.
I believe that if we take the Bible seriously, I think we'd be at the front of the line demanding climate action.
I've been thinking about that a lot on a trip to Europe, where I keep seeing these beautiful old cathedrals. Like this one is more than 1,000 years old. But there's a problem. Modern Bibles get two words wrong. Really wrong.
Sadly, there's this conflation that is leading people to literally reject the words of the Bible.
Well, when this evangelical Christian tries to set the record straight, not everyone reacts so well.
A woman with a Christian profile just called me a witch the other day. I have the screenshot.
Gotta love the comments section, right? But if you're a Christian, I just have to say, this video is not here to attack you. It's actually exactly the opposite. I think by the end, you're gonna feel empowered and motivated, especially after you see what one church in Minnesota is doing to really invest in what they call care for creation.
What can we do to reach out to people to make this a more loving, better world?
Isn't that the highest calling we have here?
And if you don't know her, that is Katharine Hayhoe, and there is no one better for this conversation because she literally wrote the book on it. Saving Us is about how we can protect our planet by starting from a place of common ground and shared values. And for Katharine, that starts with her faith.
I myself am an evangelical Christian, and I became a climate scientist because I'm a Christian.
So let's dig into what matters with Katharine Hayhoe. I think a good place to start for people to kind of set the stage here is that we have 63% of Americans, give or take, close to 2/3 of Americans identify as Christian. That's 215 million people.
But there's this finding from the Public Religion Research Institute that it's non-religious Americans who are most likely to understand what's driving climate change, 76%. At the very bottom of the list, white evangelical Christians were the least likely, only 31% understanding the human influence on climate change. And then on top of that, another recent study found that 90% of all priests and ministers and Christian leaders in the US believe in climate change, but half of them never talk about it to their congregations.
How did we get to that place?
Well, you're absolutely right, Chase. We are at the point now where people's opinions on climate change have nothing to do with their intelligence, their level of education, how much they know about science. It's simply where we fall on the political spectrum. And this is not anything new. This has been happening intensively over the last 40, 50 years. And it's really historian Mark Knoll from Notre Dame, in his book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, makes a really good case for the fact that this has actually been happening since the American Revolution. That increasingly in America, Christianity and politics have become so interwoven that now, for a good segment of the population in the US, their statement of faith is written first by their political ideology and only a distant second by their theology. And if the two come into conflict, they will go with ideology over theology. That's where we are today. And how does that relate to climate change? It relates to climate change because over the last 15 years and more, it has been at the very top of the most politically polarized issues in the US. Not because a thermometer gives you a different answer depending on how you vote, because it absolutely does not. Nor does a hurricane check who you voted for in the last presidential election before it rips the roof off your house. But because the solutions to climate change require weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, as well as addressing our unsustainable practices in agriculture and every other aspect of our society. And a lot of those changes threaten the power and wealth structures of the past century. And so that's why there's such significant ideological opposition to climate solutions, which has become integrated into American Christianity thanks to the decades-long confluence of ideology with theology.
And before we dig into that, let's be clear about the potential here. If 215 million Americans identify as Christians, and if every single one of them was on the front line saying, we want clean air, we want clean water, or we want climate solutions, it seems like this would be game over, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. And not only that, but I myself am an evangelical Christian, and I became a climate scientist because I'm a Christian. That is literally the reason I decided not to be an astrophysicist, but rather a climate scientist, because climate change is so profoundly unfair. It affects the most poor and vulnerable people in our own city, as well as on the other side of the world, who have done the least to cause the problem. So I believe that if we take the Bible seriously, from Genesis, where it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth, all the way through the Old Testament, where it talks about God's love and care for even the smallest and most seemingly insignificant aspects of nature and creation, all through the New Testament, where it talks about how we're supposed to be recognized by our love for others. Those are literally Jesus's words, until the end of the Bible in Revelation, where it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. If we took the Bible seriously, I think we'd be at the front of the line demanding climate action. And here's the thing, outside the United States, and even some people inside the United States, are at the front of the line demanding climate action because of their faith. So Bill McKibben, one of the most well-known climate activists in the US, founder of 350.org and Third Act for seniors who want to take climate action, he's motivated by his faith. All kinds of great organizations like the Evangelical Environmental Network, BioLogos, Racha, Tearfund, even World Vision, Compassion International, they care about climate change because of how it's impacting people and the planet. And last year, I had the amazing experience of speaking at the 4th Lausanne Congress. 10,000 evangelical leaders from around the world were invited to attend. And they actually asked me to give one of the plenary talks on the connection between the Christian faith and caring for people and the planet. If we believe the universe was created by God, what is science other than trying to understand the mind of God? So outside the US, that connection is there. It's just inside the US. And sadly, this perspective is spreading outside the US thanks to media. There's this conflation between ideology and theology that is leading people to literally reject the words of the Bible.
So we're gonna talk a bit about words of the Bible, both especially in Genesis. But you mentioned Revelation. Let's start at the end for a moment, because depending upon people's beliefs or interpretation, if God is going to bring an end to the earth, or if there's a new earth ahead, it seems like some people can make an argument and say, well, why am I going to care about climate change if God's just going to come in here and wipe the slate clean anyway?
Oh, you're totally right, Chase. In fact, I've even had people say, well, if climate change is going to hurry things along, then let's get going. Yeah, I know. I do have a forehead-shaped dent on my desk after hearing things like that.
I almost had one hearing that.
Yes. So that is definitely something that people say. But here's the thing. Humans have always been humans and have always thought the same way. So 2,000 years ago, when the apostles and Paul, for example, were writing the New Testament, there were people back then who were saying, well, the world's going to end anyway, so why do we care? And they were basically quitting their jobs, putting their feet up, being like, Maranatha, come Lord, come. The end's going to come anyways. May it come quicker. And Paul wrote to these people in the book of Thessalonians, and he essentially said, get a job, care for the widows and the poor. You don't know what's happening in the future. And so, but in the meantime, you have something to do. Like Jesus literally said, we should be recognized by our love for others. And trying to accelerate a global catastrophe that is causing massive suffering, especially among the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet, is in no way, shape, or form sharing God's love with others.
Speaking of God's love, that brings us, I think, back to Genesis, maybe one of the key verses here, Genesis 1:28, where these words subdue and dominion come up in so many translations of the Bible. And I think there are a number of people who say, well, see, God said, we have dominion over earth. We can do what we want, drill, baby, drill. Why is that not the right way to think about this?
Well, I'm a big fan of manuscript studies of the Bible where you look at the context, and then also where you look at where the same word, which in Hebrew that word is Radah, R-A-D-A-H, where that same word is used elsewhere in the Bible. And that gives you really good context for what is meant for that word, because obviously dominion and subdue, those are translations into English that reflect the perspectives and the biases of the translators, because most of us are not fluent in Hebrew. I mean, I certainly am not myself. Don't know about you. No,
none.
Yes. So if you look at this word that's used when it says that we have dominion or responsibility over every living thing on this planet, first of all, the interesting thing to me is every living thing includes each other too. It's not just talking about plants and animals. It's talking about our sisters and our brothers too. And then when you look at where that same word is used elsewhere, it's used, for example, in the Psalms to talk about God and God's relationship with people and with the earth. And it talks about how God will Radah in order to do something, in order to extract every value, every last ounce of value from the earth and then throw it in the dustbin. No, it says God will Racha in order to save the needy and listen to the cries of the vulnerable and the poor. And it's very clear that word is used in the sense of having responsibility to care for those that need it. So if you take that context of the word Racha as it's used elsewhere in the Bible, and you apply it to that verse in Genesis, God has given humans the responsibility to care for every living thing on the earth. And that's a radically different perspective than extracting every ounce of value than pushing the big red eject button at the end.
And if we take a literal interpretation of, in Psalm 72, I think you're referencing that God says, care for the poor and care for the needy. And then that same sort of care should be exhibited or demonstrated for our planet, then shouldn't we be caring for endangered species, be caring for threatened habitats?
Well, again, in Genesis, it does say every living thing. And so that includes all of the creatures that if we're a Christian or really a person of any faith, we believe that God created these things. And who are we through our actions to cause the extinction of things that God has created, and not only created, but told us to care for? But I wanted to point something else out there too, because all too often we think about it as people or the planet, the environment or the economy. And so it's like, well, I would like to make a choice for the planet, but really I have to make this other choice because I don't have the time or the money or anything like that. So we often set up this sort of false conflict between the two. But in reality, we are completely dependent on other living things. So imagine if humans disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow and every other living thing was left on the earth. What would happen? It'd be fine, right? Better than fine, probably. But imagine if every living thing disappeared off the face of the earth, the phytoplankton in the ocean that generate half the oxygen we breathe, all of the plants that produce the products that we eat. Imagine if all of those disappeared off the face of the earth and just humans were left, what would happen to us? I mean, we'd have like hours left, maybe a day if we were lucky.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole idea of caring for God's creation is at our own expense is completely false. The way this planet functions is that we humans are in many ways the most vulnerable species to the disruption of nature. After the polar bear, a polar bear scientist once said to me, after the polar bear, I study the polar bears because we're next. So it isn't even being about being altruistic. It's really about understanding our place in this world. And I really feel that a Christian perspective actually helps a truly Christian perspective based on the Bible, not based on the ideology that's been built up over decades and centuries. But a perspective of our role in creation is so important. So often people use this idea of like a pyramid of all the living things with humans on the top to, asserting their dominance over Earth. And then people say, no, it's like a circle. We're all part of this ecosystem. We're all dependent on each other. And to a certain extent we are, but that circle doesn't highlight the unique role of humans. I prefer a symbol where it's like a heart, where the heart's all made up of all the different species and humans are at the bottom holding the heart, because we're the ones causing the problems right now: the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the pollution crisis, and the socioeconomic crises and inequality that are driving a lot of these. But we're also the ones who can do something about it. We have the ability to understand. If dolphins had the ability to understand and do something about it, they'd probably be fixing the problem right now. We'd probably be done if dolphins were in charge. But for better or for worse, we're in charge. And that means just in charge in terms of the fact that we have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the understanding. That's what I mean by being in charge. And that means we have the responsibility to care.
You acknowledge something that I feel really strongly about, that I think so many of these problems and issues are really a symptom of disconnection, that we've created this illusion that we're somehow not just above nature, but we're somehow like separate from nature, that's out there and here's humans. We're not nature. Would you agree with that perspective? That it's really that disconnection?
100%. And that does not come from theology. That comes from Western philosophy. The idea that we are somehow separate from nature. So there's so much cultural construct that has entered our perspectives today. It's like we are looking at these issues through a very thick pair of tinted lenses. And often we don't even realize where those lenses came from and what color they're tinted.
I mean, I was doing some separate research and I was unable to find any usage of the word reconnect in English until the 1700s, which was the same time that the Industrial Revolution was beginning. So that suggests to me that like maybe we didn't even have a need to reconnect because we weren't disconnected before that.
I think so. And the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and then even the fact that we have HVAC systems, so we keep our windows closed. We live in cities that are not green in many cases, and that further separates us from nature. The arrogance of our society, thinking that we are impervious to anything nature does, and our shock when disasters hit, and of course, climate change being one of the main factors that's supersizing disasters like hurricanes, storms, floods, and wildfires. And we think somehow, how could this happen? Like it's not part of life on this planet.
I hadn't intended to ask you this, but this question comes to mind of like, there were certain, periods in history where certain, sects or parts of Christianity would almost like villainize or demonize someone who was connected with Earth, that like, these are pagan rituals, that you're a witch. But there's really like, it doesn't sound like, based on this conversation, doesn't sound like there's anything actually wrong with that like we were intended to commune with nature, right?
Oh yeah, and Chase, I mean, it's funny that you say back in the past, because a woman with a Christian profile just called me a witch the other day. I have the screenshot. So, and not only that, but I'm often accused of worshiping the created rather than the creator, or worshiping Gaia rather than God, because people can't conceive of the fact that any relationship whatsoever with non-human life could be not only possible to essential to our continued sustainability on this planet. Whereas again, if you go back to the basic fundamentals, not just of Christianity or Judaism, but any major world religion, you have that understanding of our role within and relationship to the rest of life on this planet. And I think we've really lost that, for all kinds of reasons. And again, philosophers and historians are probably better suited to talk about this, but the role of Western philosophy, the role of the Industrial Revolution, the role of the urbanization of our society and our dependence on technology that isolates us from nature. And then, like I said, again, the deliberate conflation of ideology and theology in the United States for political power. A lot of wealth and power has been gained by extracting finite resources from this planet in a way that takes no account of the fact that they are finite and does not return the value to the people and places that are impacted by it. The companies that have profited from digging up, processing, selling, and making things that burn fossil fuels, they are not paying the price for the impacts of climate change, which, this year alone in the US, people's home insurance is going through the roof. You look at how burning fossil fuels is responsible for millions of premature deaths a year, yet none of those proceeds are going to that. In fact, the fossil fuel industry is currently subsidized to the tune of nearly $1,000 per person per year, and it's making record profits. So you look at the whole structure of our society up until present day, it is all based on the assumption that we live on this flat, infinite planet where there's always more resources to get. There's always somewhere to put our waste that doesn't matter. And we shouldn't be valuing any of these things. And so all of that plays into that attitude of we are not part of nature. It doesn't matter to us, as if we could float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides, or as if we could colonize Mars and then we just all move there. And so a number of years ago, I had this incredible opportunity to be in the front row of one of Stephen Hawking's last talks before he passed away. He spoke about climate change in his talk, and he spoke about how it was one of the most serious threats confronting us. And he also spoke about AI as well, very prescient. And then he said something that stopped me dead in my tracks. He said, and that's why we have to colonize Mars. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? Like, there's no way we can get enough people and resources to Mars in time before climate change overwhelms our civilization. And so Martin Rees was speaking with me in the next session, and he was the Royal Astronomer of England, as well as a colleague of Hawking's at his same college. And I said, do you mind if I ask you a question? Do you agree with what Hawking said? And he said, and I don't do accents, you're just going to have to listen, pretend that it's a British accent. He said, oh no, he said, fixing climate change is a dawdle in the park compared to terraforming Mars. I was like, that is a mic drop and a reality check.
I'm sorry, I just personally don't want to live on Mars. Like, Earth is just really beautiful.
Yes. And if anybody doesn't agree with you and me, just go read the Red Rising series set on Mars, where they have to live underground. And then at the end of a number of books, the main character finally comes to Earth for the first time and is just overwhelmed with the beauty and the accessibility of Earth. And it's just like, there's just no comparison.
Yeah, like the moon, Mars, pick your planet. Like, it's not going to be as beautiful as what we already have. And that we were, if you believe the Bible, charged with caring for and protecting this beautiful place that we live.
Well, scientists nowadays, astronomers are discovering exoplanets, right? And one of the first thing they do when they discover an exoplanet is they start asking, how far is it from its star? Is it in the habitable zone? Does it look like it could have an atmosphere? And David Baker is an astrophysicist who's one of the leads on the Exoplanet Survey, and he edited my Talking Climate newsletter a couple of months ago. And in it, he shared how so far they've discovered 80,000 exoplanets, which is a huge number. These are planets around other stars, not our sun. Not a single one looks like it's habitable.
And even if it was, again, like we already have a really beautiful, habitable one right here.
Exactly. And even if it was, we couldn't get there anyways because it's too far away.
Not in my lifetime.
Yeah.
To come back to Genesis for a moment, because I want to ask you about one other word that gets thrown around a lot, and it's this word subdue. One way that I've thought about it is that, like, if you consider like how a farmer might subdue a field, like sure, he's going to plow the field and weed it, but then like once he has subdued the field and he's like planting crops, he's not just going to like take a bulldozer and drive through it, right? Because he has dominion over the field. Is this maybe a good illustration for how we might actually think about that word and its roots?
Yes.
In literal and metaphorical roots.
The word in the Bible, the word that you're talking about, subdue, is kavash. And again, forgive my accent, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but it primarily means cultivation, stewardship, and responsible development. So obviously humans need food, we need water, we need safe places to live. And all of that requires sustainable management of our resources on a round, finite planet that's currently shared by 8 billion people to make sure that there's enough for all. So let me give you an example of something that I think is not responsible development, and that's our food waste. We waste over 40% of the food we produce. In rich countries, we simply throw it out. We order too much, we buy too much, it goes bad, we throw it out. Or it doesn't look good, and we throw it out. In poor countries, they don't have the refrigeration or the ability necessarily to get it to market before it spoils. And so there, a lot of the food waste is just because it goes bad before people can eat it. There's 2 billion people in the world out of 8 billion that don't have enough to eat every day. And we have enough food waste to give every single one of those people a square meal a day. So addressing food waste, which when it decays produces heat-trapping gases that are also continuing to build up in the atmosphere, wrapping that blanket around our planet. Most of them come from burning fossil fuels, but some of them come from food waste too. So addressing that issue doesn't just address climate change, it also addresses hunger, it addresses poverty, and it helps to be using our resources in a sustainable way, I think consistent with the Hebrew kavash.
I mean, it reminds me of this thing I wanted to ask about, this idea of like how we manage or how we behave is a reflection of our values, of Matthew saying like where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It sounds like not just Christians, but like so many people in America, like our values maybe aren't in the right place, that we're not just prioritizing like caring for other people.
I think you're totally right. And there's a lot of interesting research that's been done in the last decade or more on what truly brings happiness, what truly brings contentment and fulfillment in life. And, they've done research where they showed that, obviously, if we don't have enough money to pay the bills, if we're under a lot of financial stress where we can't even have enough food for our family, or we can't pay the medical bills, or we can't pay the rent, that's a source of significant stress and unhappiness. But what they've showed is that at the point where we basically have enough to meet our needs, that's like peak income happiness. And then, as people's income grows, their level of happiness can actually decrease rather than increase, because we lose touch with the things that money can't buy that are even more important, like friendships, relationships, time spent doing the things we love in the places we love. Spending time outside in nature is incredible for our mental health as well as our physical health. Yet often we might live in places where it's difficult to do that. So I think that our faith makes a very solid case for not finding our happiness in money. I mean, Jesus even says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, speaking of money, and unto God what is God's. It gives us tremendous, not just joy and happiness, but these days it gives us tremendous hope when we're doing something that makes a difference for somebody's life, when we're expressing love for people or for places. It makes me think of this story I read in the Guardian last year, where there was a young woman who was really, really worried about climate change. In fact, many people these days are extremely worried about climate change. And she decided to volunteer in a local park to pick up trash. So every week she would show up with a group of other people and they'd pick up trash. And she said it turned out to be the most joyful, fulfilling thing that she had ever done. It helped her feel so much better. And she was doing something she enjoyed and she was making a difference. I mean, doesn't having purpose and fulfilling that purpose, isn't that what gives us that joy and that happiness and contentment? And sharing love with other people, especially if we believe as Christians that God has already poured out so much love in our hearts that we have an infinite amount to share with other people, isn't that the highest calling we have here?
Talking about hope, I experienced some of that when I saw this church in the Twin Cities that just unveiled solar panels.
With all the climate issues that are out there and the talk of it, several of us thought a few years ago we ought to go solar because this is a big facility and it uses a lot of energy. But we thought this would be a really good project for the church, for care for creation, and to express to the community all out there about our witness to care for creation by actually spending some money to do it. Of all the days for snow to come, here we are, not the shining, it was a beautiful sunny day. We would have loved to have the panels being reflected and shine out, but snow came. In the morning when we had our meter going, we still had about 15% electricity being generated.
Even through the snow?
Even through the snow.
Where did you get this term or hear this term, care for creation?
That's a term often used, at least in the Lutheran Church, to frame up our stewardship and responsibility for God's creation and to take care of it for future generations, to preserve it. It really is woven through much of the scripture. And so care for creation is a phrase that's emerged to describe our responsibility and our actions as Christians to care for God's creation.
And there was so much, there's excitement and there's enthusiasm around this. What's something that you've come across lately, even if it's just like a small example that's given you hope?
Well, a couple of years ago, I started to practice hope very deliberately through sharing every week good news about climate solutions, not so good news about how climate change is affecting people and things that we care about, like fertility rates and the quality and availability of chocolate and our home insurance for a house, and then sharing something that people can do. And then people started to write in and share things that they were doing too. So it made me think of when I was 2.5 years old, I got a Fisher-Price castle. It was actually a bribe for getting a sister because, I was the only child and the first grandchild, and I did not like having competition for attention. So I was gifted this Fisher-Price castle by my grandparents, and it was my prized possession. I loved that Fisher-Price castle. And then eventually my sisters got to use it when I got too old. And then we have passed that Fisher-Price castle through every child in the family who has loved it equally. And so, things like that are just, it's not going to give us world peace, but it's definitely showing us what a future looks like where we have everything we need for sustainability and for happiness.
And we have all of the solutions that we need, which you've nodded to this, but you're talking climate newsletter that you put so much thought into. So I'll make sure to put a link to that in the description for anyone that is not already following you. But you brought up Christmas, and it made me think of this like old idea of like bad kids get coal in their stocking. And I'm like, how did that get tangled up in all of this? How do we undo this like seemingly like silly little thing, but I feel like maybe also symbolic?
Oh, it totally is. I think there's a few people who should be getting coal in their stocking this Christmas. The people who are
might like that though.
Yeah. It's true. People who have actually chosen to have coal in their stocking, I should say, because they're choosing to keep us dependent as long as possible on the old and frankly dirty and polluting ways of getting energy that served us well in the past when we didn't have any other options. But today, I live in Texas, and on an average day in Texas, we already have 38% of the power on our grid is coming from wind and solar energy, with 5 or 6 different types of storage already online. So, because of course the sun doesn't shine all the time, and the wind doesn't blow. But we have all these different ways to get energy, to store energy, and to use energy, like using heat pumps to heat and cool our homes instead of furnaces and air conditioners, for example, using electric vehicles or public transportation instead of, internal combustion cars. We have different choices that we can make to make a difference. And right now, it's as if Henry Ford had built the assembly line already and was turning Model T Fords off the assembly line, and people were trying to get us to reinvest in horses and buggies. Or it's as if we already had the new, cell phone, and people were like doubling down on party line telephones. It isn't helpful. And it doesn't actually help improve people's well-being, tying us to the fuels of the past, which, like I said, are responsible for millions of premature deaths a year from air pollution, is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing for people and the planet and our future.
And before we wrap up here, I want to acknowledge, I think, something we both share, which is that we believe that words are powerful. It's the reason we've been talking about word choice in translations of the Bible. The words that we speak are important. You have this conversation all the time, I'm sure. You're having conversations with Christians who maybe aren't so convinced about climate change. Maybe they're, in opposition to addressing climate change for various reasons. Have you found a particular verse, a particular anecdote, anything that really changes people's minds in these more intimate conversations?
That is a great question. So my favorite type of invitation to speak is usually when I can sort of tell that the person inviting me doesn't actually want to have the conversation.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, exactly. So I still remember when I was asked to give a chapel service at a Baptist college, and you could really tell the person giving me the invitation had been outvoted by the other members of the committee. I said yes right away. I was like, I am there. And so that was where I first tried the approach that I would do today in answer to your question, which is, first of all, always begin conversations with what you have in common, not what divides you. So, for example, if I'm speaking to another Christian, I would start with what I have in common, what we both believe and agree on, not what we might disagree on. And what that does is it establishes the relationship so you can actually have a conversation. So it's really hard to have a conversation if somebody's already stereotyped you and figured out where you want to go or where they want to put you. And so I think of it almost like, you pigeonhole people. So I think I'm almost like a pigeon, and people have these holes and they're trying to shove me into that hole as quickly as possible so they don't have to listen to me. But the longer they can't shove me into a hole, or they feel like they have something in common, the longer they'll sort of listen to the pigeon before just shoving it in the hole. So I think bringing up what we both agree on is sort of the prelude to actually establishing the ability to have a conversation. But then what we have to realize is that the reason why people object to and reject the reality of a changing climate, whether they say it's not real, it's not humans, it's not serious, or we don't need to do anything about it, it doesn't matter which of those objections they use. They're all aimed at not doing anything. Solution aversion is the number one reason why people reject the reality of climate change. They've been told they don't want to fix it because the solutions are counter to their ideology or identity. So many Christians have been told the solutions to climate change are Marxist or communist. They've even been told, I thought this was a joke. And then somebody actually sent me a photo of a billboard that Bernie Sanders wants to promote abortion to fix climate change. I was like, surely you're joking. Nope, that was actually a billboard. Yeah. So that somebody created to try to get people not to vote for Bernie because the abortion is a big voting issue. You see what I mean? So people have been told that all of the solutions are anti-Christian or anti-American or anti-whatever. And so in our conversation, it's more important, once we've established the ability to have a conversation over shared values, to bring in positive, constructive solutions that they could get on board with, like you just mentioned, the Lutheran Church who is putting solar panels on the roof, or what World Vision is doing to help address climate change because they see how it affects the most vulnerable children in the world, or solutions that help you save money or become more independent, or whatever solutions are consistent with your values. In the case of farmers, many of them, they see that they are very good stewards of their land. And if there's ways that they could be better stewards of their own land, then that would be a solution they might invest in, like regenerative agriculture. So that's why talking solutions is so important. I feel like it's it's the biggest thing that we haven't recognized yet is the importance of showing people that there are solutions, they work, there's a way for us to get on board. And for those of us who are already concerned, the biggest solution we're not doing personally is we're not talking about it. Most people are not talking about this issue. And I'm not talking about polar bears and ice sheets. I'm talking about what I think of as the heart and the hands. Why it matters to the people and places and things I love and you might care about too. So I've started conversations over a shared love of outdoor skating rinks or chocolate or the fact that we're both parents or we're both Christians or we both live in Texas. And that's the heart, and the hands, what real solutions look like. So that's why I started Talking Climate as a newsletter, because every week I share heart and hands. So there's no excuse to say, I don't know what to say. Every single week we've got new stories, and all people have to do is follow you too. You have new stories all the time. And I know that you share so much about the heart and the hands. And if we just share it with people around us, that is what helps to move the needle.
And maybe a little bit of the head too, because yes, God gave us oil and gas, but he also gave us a sun and wind that are clean and free, by the way. They don't send us a bill for our energy. Never have, never will.
They never run out on us. Whereas the physical resources that we dig up and burn, they do run out eventually. Yes.
Yeah, God only gave us so many dinosaur bones that are under the earth. Like, we're going to run out of dinosaur bones. We're not going to run out of the sun anytime soon.
We absolutely are not. And that reminds me of my favorite verse in the Bible, which is actually nothing to do with creation or green or nature. My favorite verse is in Timothy, where Paul says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, because that is the emotion that is really underlying most of the denial and rejection, is people are afraid of what would happen if we address this issue. And of course, people are also afraid of what would happen if we don't address this issue. But Paul says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, which means if we're afraid, most people, if we maintain fear for too long, we're paralyzed. Whereas if you have power, you're empowered to act. So God has given us the ability to act. And he says with love and with a sound mind, which means we can use that mind that God gave us to make good decisions, like you just said, with the information that science gives us.
Katharine, that is a beautiful, perfect place, I think, to wrap this up. Thank you for your time and your passion. This has been such a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.